Okay, so what I want to talk about, and I'm very grateful to the first two speakers for giving such a wonderful introduction to big data, and luckily not talking about some of the things I want to talk about. I want to start with a question, starter for 10. What am I talking about here? A picture taken of yourself that is planned to be uploaded to Facebook, MySpace, or any other sort of social networking website. You can usually see the person's arm holding out the camera, in which case you can clearly tell that this person does not have any friends to take the picture of them, so they resort to MySpace to find internet friends and post pictures of themselves, taken by themselves. A bleep is usually accompanied by a kissy face or an individual looking in a direction that's not towards the camera. This was the word of the day on October 12, 2012 in the Urban Dictionary, and that word is? A little bit more enthusiasm. Obviously, I've chosen this because this is the word of the year according to the Oxford Dictionary. Selfie. How many of you had heard this news this week? A smattering of hands. Okay. So, this is me in Abu Dhabi yesterday, taking a selfie in one of the luxurious hotels we were staying in. So I take these myself. I'm a social media researcher, but also a very active user. I take selfies with my dog, with my horse. What is relevant about the selfie is that this, and the first two speakers have talked about this, is the absolute rise in the use of photography and the sharing of images. And Mike talked about the nightmare of social media data. So this is the space that I work in. And if we just look at the statistics, and these are very recent statistics from this week, is that Facebook, with its just over 1 billion users, has 350 million images uploaded every single day. Image sharing app Instagram, 150 million users, 50 million images a day. But what is really interesting, and I give these types of talks regularly, Snapchat has come not out of nowhere, but in terms of volume of data, has all of a sudden really risen. So Snapchat is an app where you can share images, but they disappear. You can kind of time how long you want the recipient to see the image. And obviously, the kinds of images that get shared are ones you don't really want to be seen or deposited anywhere. But what's interesting about Snapchat is that combined, users share over 400 million images or snaps a day. And what's interesting about this is the ephemerality, or the perceived ephemerality of these images. So one of the things I think about big data is this tension between, is the data permanent in all sorts of different permutations, but also this idea of ephemerality. And Snapchat is a really interesting app that kind of has moved into this market for people wanting data to be forgotten, for people wanting to be the data to be ephemeral. There's all sorts of issues with Snapchat where it's been shown that the data is not as ephemeral as users think, so be careful what you share with each other. That takes not even into account the 1 billion tweets that are sent every 2.5 days. A lot of those are also images. People link a lot to images. That also doesn't take into account that Twitter has recently changed how you experience image viewing in the platform. And one of the things that's really interesting is previously you had to, I mean, there's a lot of history about how Twitter has dealt with images, and I can go into that in the Q&A, but most recently, you had to click on a link to reveal the image. And what they've done in the last few weeks is they've made the platform more image-friendly so that you see the image as you scroll through a feed. You actually see the image, and what that has subsequently done is people tend to now share more, because you see the image and then you just click retweet or you do something with the image. So there's very interesting ways in which people are responding to this. This also doesn't take into account image sharing platforms like Pinterest and Tumblr. So there's lots and lots of image activity on social media. And different people are starting to do different things with these images. This is an exhibition that's on at the moment, the Aggregate Eye, and what these people have done, Hochman, Manovich, and Cho, is they've collected over 2 million Instagram images and they've visualized them, and they've looked at different patterns to show what is going on across these different cities in a different number of variables that I will talk about. So people are doing stuff with these images. But what I would argue is that they are not valued in the same way that users value these images. Right? For me to take a selfie with my dog, I'm attributing a value to that act, and then to share that means something. This value is not readily recognized by the academic research community. So there's this weird disjuncture, I would argue, between the ways in which images are valued by users and the ways in which they are not valued necessarily by researchers. And I think it's interesting that the different types of images that have been discussed up until now are very, very different images. So they don't tend to be images, the kinds of everyday images that I'm talking about here. The other thing I think about big data, and a number of pitfalls have already been mentioned, is that big data techniques tend to focus on words and numerical data. So the data that tends to get processed tends to be words and numerical data. And so, for example, the technique of natural language processing, language here really means words. This is not visual language. So in terms of natural language processing, if you were harvesting millions and millions of tweets, then you can pick out, when people are talking about selfies, or you can combine, co-location of certain words and infer all sorts of things about what people might be saying about these selfies, or how they're being interpreted, but it's not getting at the content of the image. And that's the thing that I think is really missing. So another thing in relation to these images, if you think about how many are uploaded on a daily basis, these social media companies have ginormous archives now of this kind of vernacular visual culture that is all over the internet. And they value the images in a very particular way. So if you think about a company like Facebook, they love images, but not necessarily for their content, but for what the users do with these images and for what kind of data that then delivers to the company, right? So if users tag users, for example, that the company didn't know about, or that where connections hadn't yet been revealed by users. So for example, if I now took a picture, a selfie with me and the panel, and then connected and showed that I am somehow connected to these people, that is a new connection that had not yet shown up in my profile. And that is what the company is interested in, because that can be mined. And that also then feeds the algorithms in terms of searching for other connections and valuing those connections. Locations, which has already been talked about quite a lot, is another one that these companies are really interested in. Where are you? What they're not necessarily interested in is what is in the picture, what is the content of the picture, and what does that mean? So the exhibition that I mentioned, the Aggregate Eye, is interested in the content of the picture, but in particular variables. So the time the picture was taken, the hue, kind of what color combinations do these Instagram pictures have, and so on. How are they montaged, location. But again, not the specific content. Not, is this a picture of a female academic and her dog? And that's the thing I'm interested in. The other thing that I work in a lot is social media research related to crisis communication. And one of the projects that I've done that you may have heard of is Reading the Riots, where we analyzed 2.6 million tweets from the riots, but we didn't look at images. And one of the things that I've been writing about ever since, in a way, is why not? Why were the images of the riots not of interest, not to The Guardian, not to the academics I was working with at the time, and also not to Twitter? In relation to crisis communication, and particularly in relation to this kind of issue around real time, arise issues around the worry around misinformation, rumors. So this is one of the things we looked at in Reading the Riots, and also how you verify information, particularly in real time. So when a crisis hits, how can you sift through these millions and millions of images, millions of tweets, likes, and all sorts of activities on social media to actually figure out what is going on the ground, or how people are responding? And I'm not going to read out this whole quote, but there's a really good special issue in Newman Reports from last summer that talks about the rise of this kind of age of verification, that what we now have is all these people online doing something in terms of verifying information, and that there is an abundance of data, but there's also an abundance of people doing things with this data in a kind of crowdsourced way. And one of the examples that I've looked at in relation to this age of verification is Hurricane Sandy. And one of the things that came out in the mainstream media was the concern about fake images. So sharks in the floodwaters was kind of a key one that always comes up. This was fake. People were sharing images from disaster movies. So Anonymous was sharing stills from The Day After Tomorrow. People were photoshopping images, saying that this is the storm on its way. So people were doing all sorts of things with images that I think need unpacking in terms of what kind of fakery is going on here. This is one that I'm really intrigued by. This is the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Arlington Cemetery, and this was being shared as an example of a nation pulling together the bravery of these soldiers who, despite the storm kind of coming their way, stayed in place. Now, one of the things about this image, it's not fake, but it's also not happening during Hurricane Sandy. It was an image that was taken from at a previous storm and then was circulated during Hurricane Sandy. So it's not fake in the sense that it's Photoshopped, but it's also not what you think you're looking at. This image, the flooding of Ground Zero, everyone thought was fake because it almost looked too good to be true, but it was actually a professional photographer from Associated Press, and it was real. And so what we did is we wrote a piece. I wrote this with two Australian researchers, Jean Burgess and Axel Bruns, and one of the things we were really intrigued by is this issue of fake images and whether or not it was a real problem. So over the Hurricane Sandy weekend, we collected 250,000 tweets and specifically looked at whether or not, in terms of volume, these fake images were such a problem, and we concluded that they weren't. But it is very interesting to think about who is sharing them, where are they in terms of this long-tail distribution, which you tend to get in social media. So you get a very, very long tail of things that don't get shared a lot, but may be highly valuable, and we don't quite know how to deal with this. Because the most visible images, sharks in the floodwater, may not be the most valuable. They may be valuable for kind of humorous reasons, but not necessarily if you're an emergency responder. So what I think the Hurricane Sandy images revealed in relation to looking at images and big data is what is meant by fake and real. Is it fake as in Photoshopped? Is it fake as in a still from a Hollywood disaster movie? Is it fake as in you think you're looking at something and you're not? Or is it perceived fake, but it's real? And these are really theoretically very, very complex issues to grapple with, and algorithms are not going to save you here. In terms of the UK riots, so the overall Reading Riots project didn't look at images, but I kind of put a small team together to look specifically at some of the images, and we found all sorts of additional image sharing practices that makes this field even more complicated. So one of the things we found was this very, to us, bizarre practice of people taking photographs of their TV screens and then putting them onto Twitter to say, this is happening right now. Right? So that's, to us, kind of mind-blowingly meta in the sense that Twitter is always seen as the second screen. So television is the first screen, Twitter is the second screen, but then on the second screen you are re-shown the first screen in this kind of collective active viewing. And in this particular photograph, it was also clearly happening within a domestic space. And one of the things that has puzzled us to this day is why people would upload an image that shows lots of vibrators in front of the television. This is quite a popular image. Also, why would journalists be joining in these activities? So this is Jonathan Hayes from The Guardian, and he joined in this activity to show that he was watching Sky News as a Guardian journalist to say, this is happening right now. Right? Theoretically, this is complicated. We had lots of photographs that we did some sort of forensics on where people were suggesting that they were at the riots and weren't because they were in Pakistan and couldn't possibly be in the Farfellas in Rio de Janeiro and then also in London the same day. And so you have to do, you know, various steps of kind of forensics to kind of figure out what's going on in terms of who's uploaded it and what are they claiming. We found lots of altered images. So people basically saying this is kind of like a first shooter game. And it means that you have to bring all sorts of other resources to then understanding what is going on here, what is being said, what is being suggested in these images. And then finally, a link to the previous presentation in terms of Google, and also Mike mentioned this, in terms of Street View, we found quite a lot of Google Street View images where this is the carpet shop, and I don't know if people remember this, but this went up in flames. And so what you got a lot of was compilation images where people went onto Google Street View, which had not yet been updated, so you could still see the carpet shop in the past as it was, next to carpet shop in flames. And what's very interesting to us is that this raises all sorts of questions about who is the photographer and who is, you know, creating these images, and is it even a human being? So when people are starting to draw on data sets that are out there and then basically using those to do all sorts of different things that we would suggest are around witnessing, this again complicates the matter a great deal. So what I will say as a kind of conclusion is that one of the things that baffles me is that in terms of big data, there is no real emphasis on images, yet there are so many images on social media. So what tends to happen is in the data cleaning process, when you go through the tweets, the links that point to images gets thrown away. And why? I don't understand why this is happening. I think it also raises issues around who is taking these images. So who's the photographer, and is the photographer even human? And I think this is a really important thing to start considering and to start developing new theories. So Mike was saying this is, you know, we are no longer so concerned with theory, and I think I really agree with that, but I think we ought to be. This is, you know, this needs real theoretical underpinning. It needs robust methods, and I think visualization techniques that can help us understand these large data sets for dealing with big data and images on a large scale. Thank you.
I was reminded that I've been talking recently to some companies that look at data mining from social media from the point of view of people wanting to understand their customers or their audiences or their potential customers, and, you know, aggregating mining all the kind of data that is there as you described. And I said to them, well, you know, if you do this sentiment analysis to try and look at not only who is mentioning your company in a tweet maybe, but are they saying, yes, what a great company, or you're driving me mad again, or whatever. And they said, you know, we look for words and analyse sentiment. And I said, well, so how do your algorithms deal with irony? And they all went, no, it doesn't really. They said if you could write an algorithm that spots irony, you'll be minted. And I wondered that when you're talking about people using social media for images, and, you know, of all the petabytes of data out there, I understand quite a lot of that now is in the form of images. Whether people consciously or unconsciously are kind of using the technology platforms to produce things in a form that actually isn't readily capturable. Whether the human use of the technology is kind of staying one step ahead of the capacity of the algorithms and the machines to keep track and measure what's going on. That was a question. I know it sounded like a long ramble,
like a statement,
but it was a question.
I mean, I think the thing about images is that I think image analysis, from my perspective, which is more coming out of visual culture, the people who tend to work within the domain of visual culture tend to be art historians or people coming out of photo theory, and they tend to look at kind of art and particular kinds of images, but not necessarily at vernacular culture or everyday images. So there's something, I think, about these kinds of images that have missed the attention of a number of different researchers. So the people who can deal with images don't necessarily want to deal with them because they're particular kinds of images. The people who can deal with scale or algorithms and so on, they're not necessarily interested in images, or they're interested in images in the way that I showed the aggregate eye. They're in particular elements of the images, or as Ed talked about, stitching them together, this kind of again, that is dealing with vernacular culture, but that is not getting at what is the meaning of these images. And I think that is an incredibly difficult nut to crack, because context is incredibly important in any case. So when you're dealing with a tweet, the context is incredibly important. But when you're dealing with an image, you're not only dealing with the complexity of context, you're also dealing with reading the content, visual content, and that's always been a very difficult issue. Never mind then trying to combine the text and the image in terms of how they combine meaning together. So I think it's an issue of how do you do thorough, qualitative, small-scale analysis, and how do you scale that up?
I mean, I think scale is a key point here. I mean, we are interested in the content of images. To us, it's an interesting artificial intelligence problem, because we train algorithms to try and identify features from images. The obvious example from the street view is we're looking for street signs and trying to work out what's the name of this street, what's the name of this business. But we're training algorithms to look at those selfies and the pictures that are put out there to try and recognize features that might exist in those pictures. We're not quite sure what we might use that for, but it's an interesting problem. And there's quite a lot of success we've had in. The most bizarre thing I think we've recognized so far is we're quite good now at recognizing shredders, the things that shred paper, which are very boring beige boxes that rarely you see in pictures. But nevertheless, the algorithms, for whatever reason, are really good at recognizing them. If only we could come up with a useful application for this.
But I heard also that there was a breakthrough in algorithm that could recognize cats, and there was a lot of excitement about the cat recognizing
It's the same algorithm. Cats on one end, paper shredders on the other end.
So everything on Google Images, basically there's a continuum with cats at one end, shredders on the other, and everything else is assigned a numerical value on the cat shredder continuum.